started planning this conference a couple months ago, our default for swag, of course, was an honors t-shirt. And we do honors t-shirts every year. But at the National Honors Conference in November, they gave out these scarves. And they just look so cool. So we decided we'd do scarves, thinking that it would be cold.
It's cold too.
So my idea is, when you have grandchildren, you could show them this and say, you know, when I was a kid, it would get so cold, water would freeze, and people would put these around their necks to stay warm. Okay? So it's kind of a future memento for your grandkids. Which is my segue into tonight's topic, right? So the conference is going to shift to our focus on the environment and how we might green honors programs. We'll have a lot of sessions tomorrow morning. And tonight we have a speaker to talk about Laudato Si, the new encyclical on the environment. And you'll hear me talk about the encyclical in my homily tomorrow at Mass. So, but right now we're going to have Brian Henning, who teaches in the philosophy department and in environmental studies, which is a new major for us, 4 or 5 years, maybe? Something like that. Brian told me he was not in Seattle U's honors program, but he did take a lot of honors classes. So he feels comfortable with all these megawatt people. Okay.
You're going to tell them why I wasn't in honors?
You didn't tell me why you weren't in honors.
I did, remember? I said I played too much pool in high school.
Oh, you did say that. I have a hard time believing that.
It's true.
Okay. I think the best way to introduce him is just to give you the title of the books he's written, plural, which is why I don't think he played pool in high school. First one, no, maybe, I don't know the order. The Ethics of Creativity, Beauty, Morality, and Nature in a Processive Cosmos. He's a Whiteheadian. Genesis, Evolution, and the Search for a Reasoned Faith, which he co-authored with some other people. And then his latest one, I think, is Riders in the Storm, Ethics in an Age of Climate Change. Hence the scarf joke. He teaches a course in climate change. He teaches environmental ethics. And I'm sure he teaches a bunch of ethics and human nature courses for the philosophy department. I thought, Linda and I thought he'd be a perfect person to talk about Laudato Si and its implications for Jesuit higher ed, and maybe even specifically for honors programs in Jesuit higher ed. We'll see if he gets that specific. Brian?
Thank you, Father Clancy, and for the opportunity to chat with all of you today. And I like this, I don't know if you've seen this going around, this art installation in Spain is an interesting backdrop. I'm hoping to be a little bit provocative and give you something to think about today and then moving into tomorrow. So I'm hoping that I achieve that to some degree. What I'd like to do is to set a little bit of a context by looking at just the first 5 minutes of Naomi Klein's, the movie version of Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything movie. So it's just like 5 minutes, set a context, and then I'll jump into my presentation. So let's see if we can make the tech work.
always kind of hated films about climate change. What is it about those vanishing glaciers and desperate polar bears that makes me want to click away? Is it really possible to be bored by the end of the world? It's not that I don't care what happens to polar bears. It's just that we're told that the cause isn't out there, it's in us. It's human nature. We're innately greedy and short-sighted. And if that's true, there is no hope. But when I finally stopped looking away, traveled into the heart of the crisis, met people on the front lines, I discovered so much of what I thought I knew was wrong. And I began to wonder, what if human nature isn't the problem? What if even greenhouse gases aren't the problem? What if the real problem is a story, one we've been telling ourselves for 400 years? This first struck me in the craziest place. I was in a stately home in the English countryside that looked an awful lot like Downton Abbey. It was an invitation-only meeting hosted by the world's oldest scientific organization, the Royal Society. Instead of ordering around the servants, the people here were trying to order around the sun. I mean the sun, in the sky. They were discussing a plan to spray chemicals into the stratosphere to turn down the temperature for planet Earth.
What you need to do is put a small number of particles up in the upper part of the atmosphere. And those particles will deflect just a tiny bit of light. One garden hose to the sky could eliminate global warming for the entire northern hemisphere.
In other words, let's solve the problem of pollution with more pollution.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid. Bearing the lead. Is there any possible way this can come back to bite us in the end?
Here's the thing. This idea may be crazy, but it's also totally logical within the story that the Royal Society pioneered in the 17th century. Here's how it goes. The Earth is not, as most people thought back then, a mother, to be feared and revered. No. Science had granted men godlike powers. The Earth is a machine, and we are its engineers, its masters. We can sculpt it like a country garden. We can extract from it whatever we want. These scientists help turn the mother into the motherlode. This story is where the long road to global warming began. When I realized that, I stopped tuning out those sad polar bears, because unlike human nature, stories are something we can change.
All right, so this idea of stories is part of my context here. These lights are just a little bit brighter than I like. All right, you chose a black background, which probably wasn't the best choice. So the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we have in the context for the worldview justifying our baseline actions and our baseline values is kind of what I want to reflect on today, and to think about what metaphors we're using in order to frame how we understand ourselves and our relationship to nature, and how that influences the way we construct our curricula, and have for quite a long time, maybe from the start in some ways. 6 parts unequally, and so you can keep track of just how close you are to break time. Sorry to be between you and that. So what I'd like to start off with is the idea of sustainability, which is the way that we're primarily encouraged to think about addressing the problem, the crisis, right, is to make our activities more sustainable. And frequently, the way that we are encouraged to think about sustainability is encouraged through the UN, defining sustainability as being able to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, which seems like a really, really good idea, right? We shouldn't do things today that would make it impossible for people in the future to meet their needs, and it does seem like a very reasonable sort of approach. As an ethicist, what I'm interested in is asking, is this concept full-bodied enough to count as the basis for our ethics, for a moral concept, for how we ought to relate to the world and how we ought to conceive of ourselves? And my suggestion is, although it's a good idea, I'm not arguing against sustainability, I'm going to suggest that it's not a sufficient basis for ethics, and so that it's not full-bodied enough. But some of my colleagues disagree. There are philosophers who do suggest it, and that it is the best we can do for ethics, and that we ought to design our thought around it. I don't share his view. So when I think of what we mean by sustainability and constructing society in a way that's sustainable, I frequently think of, and I apologize, this is very quite dated really, but I think of sort of a bright, shiny Jetsons-like future. 1960s, technological utopia, right? Get to fly around in awesome little spaceships. And fortunately, we don't need to worry about teachers who can, go on strike or expect benefits. We've got teach bots who are far superior in every way, as you know. Thankfully, society is still centered around the most important things. And then, it's just perfect, right? And as we remember, and from the year 2000, this is what it looked like. As far as I can tell, in this technological utopia, though, when you think a little bit more about it, right, it's, everything is built up on stilts up above the planet. I'm not sure what happened down below, but they're not on the planet anymore. They're hermetically sealed bubbles everywhere they go. There is no nature, no wind, no running water, no forest, no, right? There's one dog, as far as I can tell, right? Right, so I began to wonder, is this the bright, shiny, sustainable future? And if we scratch the surface of the Jetsons, do we get something more like WALL-E? Not, right? Is it a technological utopia or a technological dystopia? What I'm wondering is there anything about our conception of sustainability which rules out the WALL-E future? Right, so in case you didn't see the movie, we've got this situation where we've consumed everything. Our throwaway culture, as Pope Francis calls it, has consumed everything on the planet, and now all we have left is trash. We had to abandon the planet because we've killed all living things. So these nice little robots like WALL-E, these are piles of trash or garbage that they've compacted into these large structures, right? And poor little WALL-E, right, is just left trying to clean up all of the trash. But the humans have sort of abandoned the planet. We don't live there anymore because we've ruined it. Instead, we went off and we designed a perfect spaceship, and so we can live in perfect technological utopia again, where all of our needs are provided for us. It's perfect, right? We have all the food we could want, there are no material wants, right? You don't even have to walk. Walking is for suckers, obviously. You can just float around, talk to people via your screen, right? Going to the beach, it looks awesome, right? And one of my favorite, right? Welcome to economy. Big and Large apparently is the company. Buy, shop, live, right? So it's right. I'm not sure. What bothers me and what worries me is that maybe this is a perfectly sustainable life. Right? That this looks as though it could be done indefinitely. They're meeting the needs of the present and meeting the needs of the future. There's nothing that's unsustainable about this, apparently. Right? So what worries me is that maybe sustainability isn't a robust enough moral concept to rule out this possibility, which makes me nervous as an ethicist. So in particular, I think of at least 3 different ways in which, as a moral concept, sustainability is a little anemic. First of all, I worry that frequently the way that it's used, it's anthropocentric, meaning that in its classical formulation, we're suggested that what matters is present and future humans, and it is rather silent about whether or not non-humans make any difference for their own sake. All right, it's about us making our life sustainable. And insofar as you might want to think that non-human things are also intrinsically valuable, that might be a limitation of sustainability. Secondly, not necessarily, but frequently, sustainability is technophilic. It's in love with the idea that what we need to do is just manage our way, engineer our way out of our environmental problems. That they're really the problems we've created for ourselves of pollution, climate change, species extinction, rising sea levels, polluted water, polluted air are engineering problems, right? And the best way to fix them then is to engineer our way out. And we've had a pretty good track record. You know, I wouldn't bet against our engineers, of maybe some of you are engineers, we're pretty darn good at it. That's absolutely indisputable. But as a moral concept, I worry that if we frame the problem as a management problem, I worry that we miss the key problem underlying the actual crisis. And then finally, most pointedly, I think it ultimately isn't a moral concept at all. It's really probably just a biophysical concept masquerading as a moral concept. What I mean is it has to do with what processes can be done indefinitely. Right? But it's neutral as to what ought to be sustained. It doesn't tell us what is good. It presupposes what's good and says whatever is good, we ought to make it sustainable. Right? But it doesn't give us any way of knowing what counts as a good life. Thus, the Wally life, right, is sustainable, and it doesn't rule it out, right, because it doesn't give us enough content to know what counts as a good life well lived. It's neutral, or empty, it's vacuous, in my view. Now, it can be given more content, right, so it's not that it's inherently wrong, it's just simply the way it's frequently used, I think it has these problems. So, without explicit discussions of the nature of the good, without ethics, inevitably, what is to be sustained is the status quo and our frequently thin conceptions of the good life. What's to be sustained is late-stage consumer society, as far as I can tell. Right? That is what seems like we're trying to keep running as long as possible. And I'm concerned that that is neither a particularly good life, right? And even for the people who are fortunate enough to be the winners within that framework, right? Both the winners and the losers seem to not necessarily achieve a very rich form of life, which is problematic from my perspective. So maybe we should go a little bit deeper and think maybe the roots of the problem are a bit deeper. And here I'm going to recur to something that's rather old now, and some of you maybe have even read this if you've taken an environmental ethics class. And say provocatively, maybe the root is a little bit deeper, and this is where I'm thinking of Naomi Klein's claim that our problem has to do with stories. She traces it back 400 years. I want to trace it back more like 2,400 years, perhaps. Lynn White, Jr., so he's a dude, masculine Lynn White, in 1967, a cultural historian wrote this famous piece in the journal Science, arguing that the ecological crisis has historical roots, and those roots are traceable to, in particular, Christianity. He argues that we have had this quest for a long time to subdue nature. And this is, again, shown nicely in the movie we were just looking at. The idea is to control it, to get it to her to give up her secrets so as to make life better for humans. And what's provocative about his thesis is he claims that where that idea ultimately became possible was because of a particular interpretation of Western Christianity, which said that we are not part of nature, we're separate from nature, we're over and above it, that God isn't in things in nature. Well, God isn't in things in nature, God is transcendent, separate from nature. So we no longer have nature as sacred, God is a separate. We're here, and God has made all of this for our benefit, to be used as we want. So he suggests that created the conditions for the possibility of the ecological crisis. It created a dualism between us and nature, set us up above it, and that then, again, created the conditions for what later would become the scientific revolution, become modernity. But he locates the initial idea in Christianity, which in its Western form, very provocatively, he says, is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. He does not mince any words here in 1967. Now, what's interesting, lots and lots of ink has been spilled on this, as you might guess. He wants to suggest that the solutions to the ecological crisis, because they're ultimately religious, then therefore he thinks the solutions are going to need to be religious as well. So he doesn't think we need to create new technology and do new science. That because the crisis has been caused by a particular worldview, that we need to then address it at that root and create a more adequate worldview that would be then the basis for solving the crisis in his estimation. So it's not a matter of rejecting Christianity. In fact, he points out that in the Eastern tradition, he thinks that the Eastern Orthodox tradition doesn't have a lot of these problems that the Western tradition did. And I don't know, he's not a theologian. I'm not sure how seriously to take him. He's a historian. So it's not that he's, though, sort of carte blanche, just rejecting Christianity at all. In fact, he thinks that there are resources within the Christian tradition which, if we chose to rely on more, could be the basis for reforming of our worldview, which could be the basis for then a solution to the crisis. So in particular, he suggests that in 1967 that maybe the church, the Western church in particular, should appeal to St. Francis as a resource. This very radical, unorthodox position which suggests that not that we're having dominion over nature, but that there's a sort of democracy of creatures. And Francis was always sort of a minority tradition, and he suggests that maybe Francis should become the patron saint of ecology. Wouldn't that be a better basis for Christianity if it wrapped itself around this understanding instead of the other? Couldn't that be the basis for a solution to the ecological crisis? So this is one way of thinking about the historical roots of the crisis, about the story that has created the worldview that's gotten us to the possibility of the ecological crisis that confronts us. Some would suggest then, if we're looking for metaphors or stories, maybe a better story or metaphor to use is the idea not of sustainability, but of stewardship instead. That whereas sustainability presupposes a conception of the good, the idea of stewardship might be able to provide us a more rich set of conceptual tools to be thinking about how we should see ourselves and our relationship to nature. And so that is what's taken place in the last 25 years or so within the Catholic Church, within the Western Church. St. John Paul II, then Pope John Paul II in 1990, well, in 1979 first. 1979 did interestingly make, I'm not claiming there's any link between White and what Pope Francis, or Pope John Paul II did, but it is interesting. It's sort of ironic that he did 13 years later do this, right? But more importantly, in 1990, the very first major speech by a pope on the environment, on the occasion of World Peace Day, delivered this really powerful speech called The Ecological Crisis, A Common Responsibility. And it was remarkable in many ways. It recognized, just as stipulated, that in 1990, mind you, right, 1990, James Hansen only testified to Congress about climate change in 1988, 2 years prior, right? So this is sort of very early-ish in a lot of ways. Recognize that climate change is a problem, just asserts that obviously it's the case and that we're having an ecological crisis, right, 26 years ago. He links explicitly the pursuit of peace and and respect for nature, that these are inextricably intertwined endeavors. It suggests that a consistent ethic of life requires not only respect for human life in all of its forms, but also other living things as well. And although humans are uniquely made in God's image, all living things seem to be good in their own right. And furthermore, finally, and probably most pointedly and repeatedly within the speech, he says explicitly that it's not just a technological management problem, that the crisis is, in his words, a moral problem. and that therefore has to be solved from the perspective of ethics as well. Now fast forward 25 years, lots of interesting things happens. Benedict XVI is also writing on it frequently on World Peace Day speech events. Came to kind of a tradition regularly to do this. But rumblings for a long time about the idea of an encyclical on the environment, and finally we had it just recently, right, with Laudato Si, the first encyclical on the environment. And so Pope Francis is really moving this conversation forward in many ways. Pope Francis chose as his name sake, right? He named himself after St. Francis for very clear reasons, right? His emphasis on the poor and his emphasis on the environment are seem to be clearly indicated by his choice to take his papal name. Now, I don't have time to go through all these, but I'm just going to kind of summarize what I take to be major developments within Catholic social teaching on the environment in this encyclical. And there are a lot of what I would consider brand new developments that were not there a year ago. So the explicit and emphatic rejection of anthropocentrism, by name, surprisingly, I found surprising. The explicit and repeated rejection of dualism, right? That we are part of creation, we are not separate from it. The reinterpretation of dominion, I'm going to return to this one in just a second. This is one of the ones I'm going to be able to expand on a little bit. And this, number 3, is Lynn White's thesis, just so we're clear. For the first time, an explicit rejection of the intrinsic value of non-human things. And this was one of the most exciting and surprising things. For a long time, there was a real concern about pantheism. To be perfectly honest, I find that surprising, but to be honest, my best understanding was a real concern of nature worship held the church back from saying non-human things have intrinsic value. But now it's explicitly stated. Not only that, species have intrinsic value, and ecosystems have intrinsic value. And I'll talk about this 7th one as well, but an interesting emphasis of care, not just stewardship. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about 3 and 7 tonight. So lots of development. So you guys, thumbs up. Francis. So on reinterpreting dominion, Pope Francis writes, although it is true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the scriptures. Now put in your mind what I just said about Lynn White's thesis. White's thesis was that the Western tradition had misinterpreted scripture, misinterpreted the idea of dominion to entail dualism, anthropocentrism, right? He's partly admitting that at times, scriptures have been incorrectly interpreted. Nowadays, we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute domination over other creatures. That dominion does not entail domination. But that has been an interpretation, and it was a misinterpretation. An inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology, an inadequate presentation of how Christians saw themselves, right? Anthropologists saw themselves and their relationship to nature, what it is to be human, gave rise to a wrong understanding of the relationship between human beings and the natural world. Often what was handed on was a Promethean vision of mastery over the world, which gave the impression that the protection of nature was something that only the faint-hearted care about. It's because I always read these things in tandem, but Lynn White's in my ears when I read this passage, right? I mean, it seems so clear that he's responding to that kind of argument. Instead, our dominion over the universe should be interpreted more properly in the sense of responsible stewardship. Only one of 2 times, interestingly, that term stewardship appears in the document. The dominion is not domination, but entails responsible stewardship. So it's a huge change, sea change in the way that the Catholic Church is now describing how we should see ourselves in our relationship to nature, a very exciting development. So what I want to consider is this idea of stewardship a better metaphor around which to design our environmental ethic, a way of conceiving of ourselves and our relationship to nature? And I think it's an improvement over sustainability, but I still have my concerns. Why? There's this really interesting essay by Stephen Jay Gould who points out that it depends on what we mean by stewardship. What do we mean by this concept of stewardship? Gould writes in a piece in Natural History in 1990, he says, such views of stewardship, however well-intentioned, are rooted in the old sin of pride and exaggerated self-importance. We are but one among millions of species, stewards of nothing, By what argument could we, arising just a geological microsecond ago, become responsible stewards for the affairs of a world 4.5 billion years old, teeming with life that has been evolving and diversifying for at least 3/4 of that immense span of time? And he finishes this quotation by saying, nature doesn't know we're here, didn't know we were coming, and doesn't give a damn about us, is the end of the very provocative sort of, right? So he thinks the stewardship idea is hubris. By what measure could we be in charge of the universe, in charge of the planet? And when I think of stewardship, just as I'm trying to wrap my head around the metaphor, I like Tolkien, so I think of The Lord of the Rings, and I think of, in particular, the third book, right, The Return of the King. And I think of the steward of Gondor, right? This is Kingdom of Gondor. For those of you who aren't Tolkien fans, you've got this great white kingdom of Gondor, which had always been ruled by benevolent kings in the line of Numenor who had blessed with long life and were very wonderful rulers. But the line had been broken, and so now the king had left and gone playing in nature up north. And so ruling the kingdom had fallen to a series of stewards, right? The steward of Gondor, whose job was to take care of the kingdom. Now, the reason I'm thinking about it in this way and trying to encourage you to as well is the idea of stewardship. What it breaks is the idea that things are ours, right? The idea of a steward is somebody who's responsible for something on behalf of another, right? The steward, it's not the Denethor, right? The steward of Gondor, it's not his kingdom. It's the king's kingdom. Right? It's the king's people. They're not his people, it's not his land. It's kind of a crappy job. He just has all the responsibility and none of the, it's not his kingdom, but he's got to make sure it works. And he kind of sucks at it too, right? You might recall, right, he's holding the horn of Gondor, which his son Boromir had with him as he went off to try and get the Ring of Power in order to try and fight against the forces of Mordor, and his son dies. Right? And he just learned that his son died right here, and he has a bit of a mental break at this point because he thinks now everybody's doomed, and he sends his second son, Faramir, off to defend a city with no hope of success. And his son, Faramir, in fact, comes back quite injured, not dead, quite injured, but his father has lost his mind at this point and thinks he's dead and decides to put him on the funeral pyre and burn him alive, but he doesn't really know that. He's lost his mind, right? So he hops up on the pyre and he's going to light it, at least in the movie version. And so then, it doesn't end well for him. He ends up lighting himself on fire and running off the precipice in the movie version, at least. And the reason why I like this clip, which I'm going to excruciatingly let repeat, is that I wonder if we're stewards, if we're kind of Denethorian stewards, right? We're sort of in charge of the kingdom. We've lit ourselves on fire and now we're running off the precipice. Sort of feels like a potentially appropriate way of thinking about stewardship. So I'm not willing to completely give up on the concept of stewardship, but I'm worried that really it doesn't really cause us or force us to give up our anthropocentrism necessarily, depending on what we mean by it, depending on what we mean by the concept. Right? Yeah, it's a more benevolent anthropocentrism, but I'm not sure that it's justified, and I'm not sure it's enough of a switch. And I'm also not at all convinced that this is what, in fact, Pope Francis means by the concept of stewardship. I think he actually has something more radical in mind than just benevolent care of. That sounds too much like management to me. I'm a benevolent manager. I'm going to fix it all. I'll invent some cool stuff and be a really awesome steward. Don't think that's what Pope Francis has in mind. Some hints about that came from when the encyclical was released. Cardinal Turkson, who was probably involved in writing of the document, pointed out to people that stewardship only appears twice, whereas the word care appears dozens of times, and that he suggests the reason for that is intentional, that care involves this idea of loving responsibility, loving care, loving relationship, whereas stewardship is kind of a detached responsibility, a duty, right? Still a detachment, too much care. When you care for something, you're moved out of that care to act. So when you start looking for care, it appears in a lot of places, including the subtitle of the encyclical, right? It All of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, and involvements and talents. There's a nobility in the duty to care for creation. Right? This caring sort of pervades his view. If we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, which is a manifestation of the care, if you have a caring relationship, you're more likely to have a sense of awe and wonder about nature. Our attitude, if we don't have that, instead, we're going to slip back into the idea of master, consumer, right, exploiter. That there's a version of stewardship which really doesn't require us to get rid of this idea of being the master. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. That we have in Thomas Berry's words, maybe we have a communion of subjects, not just a collection of objects. That all things are in subjective relationship with each other, and that our relationship to nature should be a relationship in a rich sense. So one of the ways of thinking about this, if we wanted to try to not abandon the notion of sustainability but pump it up a little bit, we might try and say, well, there's sort of a shallow version and a deep version. So they have different orientations. The one is looking at primarily technical management. Right, we need to invent some cool tech. The other one is far more radical. It's saying instead what we need is a really fundamental change of our worldview, of our values, of our habits, and of our lifestyle. It goes right, really dramatic, fundamental shift in the aim as well. Frequently, I feel like the aim of the shallow sustainability movement is simply just to keep the buying going as long as possible, as long as we can. And then the aim of the other, right, is, as I say, is a fundamental, thoroughgoing transformation, what he calls an ecological conversion, which is going much, much further. So, in this idea of technological solution versus conversion, right, this I would take it as a version of the shallow sustainability, right, trying to develop a gigantic machine to suck CO2 out of the air so we can keep using as much right, of these fossil fuels as possible, invent our way out of the problem. And Pope Francis says rather directly that the ecological crisis, though, is not at root a technical problem, right? It requires instead, it's a moral problem. It requires solutions beyond technology. We need to deal with more than just symptoms. So deep sustainability, true stewardship would entail that. So he says it's just not enough to balance in the medium term the protection of nature with financial gain, or the preservation of the environment with progress. This is one of my very favorite quotes because it really points to how deeply he's suggesting the change needs to take place. We really need to modify our notion of progress. Progress is relative to a goal, an end in view. And you measure progress relative to how well you're doing relative to that end, that aim. And he's saying the end that we've been pursuing has been not a particularly good end, even for those who are able to progress toward it. That we need to stop and reconceive to what it is that would constitute a good life, and then define progress relative to that. So it needs a reconstituting what counts as progress. So, given that, I return a little bit to the notion of stewardship and say, is it salvageable? And my own attempt in the book that Father Clancy was mentioning came out a year ago this month. I was at this crisis point of trying to figure out what to do with the concept of stewardship, whether to abandon it or to try and salvage it by redefining it slightly. And I went the latter route, in part because of just happening upon some of the work by Thomas Berry, a cultural historian. What I was playing with right now is the idea that maybe we do need to be stewards, but maybe it's not so much in terms of fixing nature, being in charge of nature. I think that Stephen Jay Gould has got a good point about the hubris that's involved in that. Maybe, though, that stewardship is not of nature, but of our impact, of ourselves. That the stewards we must become, but right, not so much of it, but how we control our relationship to nature. And this is what the cultural historian and Catholic priest Thomas Berry called the great work of our age. Very interestingly, if you read this quote in the context of Naomi Klein's video clip, right, this idea of story comes up again. He thinks that we're at a moment in our history when we're between stories, the story of technological domination, of transcendent independence from nature, control and mastery, that story's falling apart, breaking down, but we don't yet have a new story, a new worldview that could be the basis for a more healthy, adequate conception of ourselves and our relationship to nature, so that we need to, he thinks the great work of our day is to try and create that more adequate worldview. So perhaps it's not enough to just tinker around the edges, put up a solar panel here and a windmill there, though we probably should do that too. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. And we need to take up this great work. So a few passages from Berry. He says, the historical mission of our time, the great work of our time, is to reinvent the human at the species level with critical reflection within the community of life systems and in a time developmental context, and to create a new story and a new, I call it, shared dream experience. The great work now, as we move into a new millennium, is to carry out the transition from a period of human devastation of the earth to a period when humans will be present to the planet in a mutually beneficial manner. This mutually beneficial manner for him is the key goal. How could we conceive of a definition of a good life which made it so that we could be mutually beneficial to the other species on our planet? How could we see ourselves as part of a broader biotic community rather than separate from it, over and above it? How can we take an appropriate place within it? He thinks this is our task. And it's probably the task of the next few generations as well. One of the passages in the encyclical that made me think of Berry again and how they were maybe on a similar wavelength was this great passage when Pope Francis says that we can't have an adequate ecology without an adequate anthropology. We can't begin to solve the ecological crisis until we start to reconceive of what it is to be human and how we're related to the natural world. That's the root cause of the crisis. A false sense of who we are and how we're related to the natural world. So what does this mean for curriculum? Just a few thoughts at the end. This is really, I'm trying to sort of provide a context and then maybe not provide solutions, but invitations. If I'm right, if Pope Francis is right and Thomas Berry are right, what would this mean for how we would design curricula? Have we designed it in a way that would be living up to the challenge that's that is it really taking up the great work as we're doing it? Most sustainability efforts on most campuses are focused on operations, right? They're focused on recycling bins and composting and solar panels and so on. And that's not bad. I'm not against it at all. It's good stuff. Support it, like encourage it, get involved. I'm absolutely in favor of that. But frequently we stop there. We don't talk about what would it mean to make our curricula so that they embrace sustainability not as sort of an appendage, but sort of, as one of my colleagues puts it, how would it become part of the trunk? Right? How would it be embedded deeply into what it is that we do? So Berry has, again, a nice way of putting this. He says, our universities have gone through many transitions since they first came into being in the early medieval period, but they've never experienced anything like the transition that is now being asked of them. In his view, the difficulty can't be resolved simply by establishing a course or a program in ecology. Or in our case, for example, right, we have an environmental studies major and minor. It's not enough to have a major and a minor where students who want to dedicate their life to that. It's important to do that, but we would be wrong in thinking, well, then we've met our curricular obligation by having a course of study about it. That instead, it needs to be infused throughout the curriculum, right? It needs to be deeply embedded across it. It needs to be in our economics classes, in our nursing classes, in our accounting classes, in our engineering class, right? Those are the people that are going to be running the planet, right? So both are really important. Pope Francis seems to be on a similar wavelength here. Environmental education needs educators capable of developing an ethics of ecology and helping people through effective pedagogy to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. How would we design an educational system, a curriculum, which had this as its goal? I'm not sure. I have the answer, I don't. But I think it would be meaningful to say that's our goal. How would we design a curriculum to try to achieve something like that? Universities need to decide whether they're going to continue training persons for temporary survival in the declining Cenozoic era, or whether they will begin educating students for the emerging Ecozoic era. In some of his writings, he contrasts three different possibilities: the end of the Cenozoic era, the end of this geological age, and we have two possibilities: enter the Technozoic era or the Ecozoic era. And the Technozoic era is the one that I've been talking about, this Jetsons-Wally future, and the Ecozoic era is where we become mutually beneficial to the other species around us, become part of the biotic community proper. While this is not the time for continued denial by the universities or for attributing blame to the universities, it is the time for us to rethink ourselves and what we're doing in a pretty radical way. Adding a class isn't going to do it. So return to this passage from Orr, right, that I had up at the beginning when you came in. There is a real sense in which you could say that we've gotten to where we are through one of the best educational systems ever created, probably the best, and it's created the crisis that we have. We've got amazingly well-educated people who are doing amazingly awful things. Sometimes through malice, sometimes not at all through malice, just by participating in a really problematic system that we've designed for ourselves, right? So maybe if we want to really address the roots of the crisis, we need to more radically reconceive of education as well. Thanks for your attention.
We got about a few minutes for questions.
Do you want me to field them, or do you want to?
Yeah, why don't you field them?
All right. Any thoughts? Please.
I want to push you a little bit more on your framework as opposed to the main thrust, because I think the framework actually has pretty big implications. I love Lynn White Jr.'s work, but he's an historian of technology. The man knows nothing about Christianity. And certainly if you read a lot of medieval Christianity, you know, the world was created by God. The creation reflects God, the creator. It's all supposed to be good. Our bodies are made up of the same elements of the earth. I mean, there's so much in it that's positive. I don't see how you can blame Christianity when, I'm sorry, it's capitalism. It's greed. And I think that if you don't put the blame where it's best deserved and instead hide it behind something like Christianity, then we're really not going to be fixing the problem. I mean, I do agree that Christianity has shifted over the last few hundred years to accommodate capitalism. But many Christian countries in the world have taken a lot more steps than this Christian country towards solving this problem. And one of the worst environmental countries in the world isn't Christian at all, China. I don't get the Christianity argument.
I think it's a really fair point, and it makes a great day in class. One of my favorites in every semester, my environmental ethics class. And the movie, I encourage you to watch it. Capitalism is Naomi Klein's target, right? So I can watch the movie, and it's really well done. And I don't necessarily disagree with her or you. But just to push back a little bit, White's thesis, as I take it, is not that Christianity is inherently anthropocentric, but that it historically was interpreted in that way. Right? So that it has all sorts of resources, the ones you're pointing out, that were always there. And were really even emphasized in his view in the Eastern tradition. And I agree with you, he's not a theologian, he's a historian of technology, as you say, in particular. But there's something to be said for the idea there needed to be a worldview which made capitalism and made scientific revolution possible. And by possible, as I take White's view, it means there were things in an animistic worldview that wouldn't even have occurred to you as being possible. Like the idea of damming a river, cutting down an entire forest, you would have never occurred to you to even do, because that's where the guardian spirits were. That's where it wasn't even, it wouldn't have been any more possible than I don't really contemplate whether to eat my wife. It doesn't occur to me as a possibility. I can physically do it. Ethicists have lots of things to consider, but that's not even like in the realm of possibility. Should I eat a human today? I don't know. It's not even something, not because it's not physically possible, because it's in my worldview, it's impossible. I wouldn't even consider it. And I think what's White's interesting, and I don't know how far I want to go to defend his thesis in particular, because in some ways he's just kind of giving me an excuse to talk about an interesting idea. But it is something to be said for the Christianity by sometimes interpreting itself as saying God's transcendent, humans are above nature and are here, and we can use nature however we want. That even Pope Francis admits there's been a misinterpretation, a strand within Christianity which kind of misinterpreted, right? So it's not the claim that Scripture says that, the claim is that it sometimes has been interpreted that way. And so his claim would be Christianity, a bad interpretation of Christianity created the conditions for the possibility of capitalism. And that then that got going, and now it's completely divorced of actual Christianity. So you've got China and India and everywhere else. What you've exported is a Western worldview. But when you talk to people, the frequency of where people will say, it's here for us, I can do what I want with it, I'm above it, we're the most advanced, they kind of a weird mixture of evolution and sort of weird things going on there. They would say I'm
When
over
did
it.
people start making those statements? I mean, this is it. You're missing all the historical evidence to prove your point. Philosophically, it sounds good, but historically, there is nothing there that I can see.
Like pointing to a church father who was using these views.
Go forth and multiply and
That's
exploit
right.
the resources of the earth until we exhaust them.
I think that's
remember
right. I think that's right. I wouldn't want to try and defend. I'm not a theologian either, but I was curious about this question too. Were there people explicitly, like Christian medievals, who were actually making this interpretation? I don't think there are good ones. I don't think there are good ones.
Bacon who made that.
That's right. His
And that
claim
was
is
a
not
novel
right. His claim is though Christians were making these
It's
claims.
like manifest destiny.
It's-
Even today, our politicians today say, some
Right.
of our politicians say, this is a Christian country, and we're built upon certain, morals, but they don't necessarily have anything to do with
It's
Scripture.
bad Christianity, right?
bad Christianity.
But they appeal to it in a false way, right?
Yeah.
Right. I think that's right. So it's bad theology. I agree with you. But in the end, I don't know. I'd be necessarily committed to having to defend White's claim. I think I'd be okay with saying, yeah, he had a provocative claim. Let's put it like Klein does at the feet of the rise of modern science. Put it at the feet of Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes and a mechanistic view of reality. I have deep sympathy with that too, and I'd be okay with going that route as well, because you can end up in a similar position in the end, seeing these resources within the Christian tradition that can be relied upon. I take your point.
Thank
you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Your way of framing it is really, really helpful. So one of the things I hear you saying, one of the things I sort of get from reading the encyclical is that even if even if we were not on the brink of a sort of environmental crisis, or even if there were some sort of array of technological solutions that could somehow sort of fix the physical things that are going to sort of happen, I hear you saying there would still be a moral crisis, right? There would still be sort of something wrong with the way that we're living, such that we sort of miss out on sort of lives of authenticity and depth, right? So could you say a little bit about like what am I missing out by being a kind of consuming person? Like how would my life, so how could I restructure my life such that it would be different, and what would be enhanced?
And one of the fun things that I was researching for this book project was I expected to find that climate change would create completely new problems within ethics, and in some ways has some interesting problems that are distinctive to it. But then the more I studied, the more I realized actually it's the same problem that ethics has been thinking about for a couple thousand years. We're confronted with our mortality, right? It may be sooner, and it might be broader than we thought. It might be really big right now, but it's still the same problem of how do I live with the time that I've got? And so I think back to somebody like Aristotle, who would say, wealth isn't bad, but you would be foolish to think it would by itself make you happy, right? And so he goes and spends a lot of time saying, well, what would be genuine human happiness? What would be genuine human flourishing? So we need those social interactions, we need intellectual engagement, we need our physical needs met, we need, right, and just sort of goes off But what it backs into is a certain conception of human anthropology, a certain conception of what it is to be human. So then I realized this is not a new problem at all. It's just the same problem now in a really big problematic context. It's a species challenge now, but it's the same. I think it's the same challenge we've always had. What's a good life? Yes. Sure.
Oh, sorry. Okay. As far as like concrete steps towards educating towards this like deep sustainability, what kinds of like implementations have you seen at Gonzaga or at other universities that are moving us towards that?
So we're just starting out, but one of the things I've tried to spearhead is something we're calling the Cataldo Project, and it is aimed at creating a summer workshop for our faculty, 10 or 12, so this May, I'll just speak in specific, this May, 12 faculty members will get together for a 2-day workshop where we'll discuss what do we mean by the concept of sustainability, what would be then rich ways of taking existing classes and incorporating sustainability concepts deeply into pre-existing classes. And so we'll have faculty from across the university, math professors, education professors, right, so on, who want to come and then explore different ways. I have at least 8 different ways that you could think about embedding sustainability into their class without having to dislodge other things, because we can't just keep adding more, right? And so there's a great program at, it's called the Washington Center. It's on the west side of the state at Evergreen State College, and they developed something called the Curriculum for the Bioregion. So I'll just give you one example of how this would happen in a quick sketch. So the Curriculum for the Bioregion model is you take a big idea in your discipline. Let's say it's you're doing economics, and you take a big idea that you wanted to achieve in the class already, and you take a big idea from sustainability, and you merge them together in one assignment, an integrated assignment that allows you to achieve both at the same time. So and hopefully doing a better job of both of them. So let's say you want to get at the idea of, and this is an easy one, but a negative externality is a concept in economics, right? And so you just take an idea of negative externality having to be carbon dioxide as a negative externality of burning coal. So you have the students do an assignment where they're talking about it, negative externalities in that sense, rather than talking about smoking, which is another one you could do for a negative externality, right? So it just sort of achieves it in that way. So I don't have a magic solution, but I think what my own goal would be is to try and encourage my colleagues to say, this is something they should want to try to figure out how to do in their class. That it's not just the job of the environmental studies faculty. It's how do we say, no, it's actually something that I could try to figure out how to do within my discipline, and it'll look different for an engineer than it will for an English professor than for an economist, to do it responsibly and meaningfully. But I think the goal should be there so that when students go through our curricula, it keeps coming up, and it's shown to be important within lots of different contexts, and hopefully the deeper form, not just the shallow form of sustainability. If you go to gonzaga.edu/Cataldo project, you can find, there's not a ton there, but a few electronic resources that I've cobbled together.
Great, thank you. So in the Pope's encyclical, I think it's pretty, like, for the Pope, it seems that the fate of the environment and the fate of the poor are like inextricably connected, and I just didn't hear you say anything about that, so I was wondering, like, to what extent do you think that his focus on social justice is critical in our examination of ecological justice, or is it not? Do we not need to incorporate that into a notion of deep sustainability?
Thanks for asking. I apologize if it didn't factor highly enough, because it is distinctive of his approach for sure. I completely agree, and I think it's a huge asset to the way that he's thinking about it, because really environmentalists have come around to this point where they've realized they can't really achieve their goals without focusing on poverty either, right? You can't protect the rainforest if you don't also talk about the people who live in, around, and depend on it, and right, so that the many environmental groups are finding this as well. So yeah, it's a huge asset. In fact, Jesuits in particular have been ahead of the rest of the church on this. In General Congregation 35, 10 years ago, just about, the Jesuits said that now our conception of social justice, they said in GC 35, needs to not only include our relationship to the Creator and our relationship to other humans, but that for the first time they said it must explicitly and independently indicate our relationship to creation as well. So they call it a triptych of relations. We have our relationship to God, our relationship to humans, and our relationship to Earth are all parts of, irreducible parts of justice. And so the Jesuits have been thinking about it for a decade already, and GC 36 coming up next will probably just continue that. And so I think the Jesuits in particular, we have resources to draw on for thinking about how it's all a seamless cloth. It's all part of the same project. It's not that you've got social justice over here and environmental justice over there, and and it's all part of the same project, hopefully. Thanks for your reminder. Yes, ma'am.
With the growing adversity towards religion in the younger generation, specifically in millennials, is religion really the best context within to raise up the ecological problem towards a generation that can and solve the crisis?
For some people, it will be essential. Others, it would be alienating. So it's interesting. Pope Francis wrote the encyclical To All People of Goodwill, right? Some people were surprised and sort of take up that conversation. They don't necessarily respect, they don't see themselves as part of the tradition. They don't see themselves as religious, but they still think, oh, this guy's kind of interesting, right? So that's kind of a nice development. But the way I think about it and frame it in my own class and my own thinking is what we're talking about is what your overall worldview is, your underlying worldview. By worldview, I mean sort of the lenses that we're given and put on us as we're born into a culture. It's what tells us what's good, what's bad, what's beautiful, what's true, what is success, what ought I to be like. And I think of it like a stream, like a river. You're kind of born into it, and you're floating downstream by default. And you're carried along in your worldview, and it tells you what's good, and you move along with the current regardless of, no effort is required. And what defines that worldview for many people is their religion, but for many people it isn't. But we all have sort of also some elements that are shared, some worldview elements that are shared, and this is where the capitalism part is so very important, but also the scientific revolution, sort of the modernity components too about our worldview. So I guess what I'd say is, if I'm right, if part of the challenge is a problematic, maybe bankrupt worldview, hopefully we could talk about that across people. Some people's worldview is defined by the religion, but others not. But we can all talk about the fact that we all have a worldview. So part of the job of the philosopher, as I take it, is to try and say, hey, did you know that you got one? It's been telling you what's good and what's bad, what success is, how you should see yourself in your relationship to nature all along. And you can actually kind of take the lenses off, not fully, but you can kind of look at them and realize you've been having them on the whole time, or you can realize you've been floating downstream, and you can decide whether or not you want to try and, I don't know if the metaphor breaks down, but go upstream. Like, it requires a little bit of, what's interesting about the metaphor is it requires effort to go upstream, right? You've actually got to work at it intentionally to create a slightly different worldview. So I don't know, what do you think? Is it possible to have that conversation with a person who's secular, atheist, and religious and all together?
Absolutely. I think so. We come from a campus that's not predominantly Catholic. We're very diverse, a lot of religious represent on campus. But even on our campus, there's a very favorable view towards the Pope, specifically because of his inclusive nature and specifically because he addressed it with all men of goodwill and not specifically to women of faith, I think is how he previously addressed it. So I think there is a benevolent feeling towards the Catholic Church in general and towards the idea that religion isn't necessarily so much about dogma anymore. It's about good faith towards everyone and not hurting people in general, not hurting the environment. I think there's a possibility, but I think that still a lot of young people are just averse to religion in general, especially those who grew up in very conservative families, those from conservative regions. But I hope that they don't exclude it necessarily.
Well said. Yes, ma'am.
So I just want to bring up something that Pope Francis mentioned about differential responsibilities between countries, specifically developed countries and underdeveloped countries. And I guess something I was thinking about when you were talking about this sort of call, and it's obviously echoed in the encyclical, to rethink what human nature is. Although I think that's wonderful, and philosophically I can agree with it, but economically I find that sort of problematic, because obviously you're coming from a philosophical perspective as a professor of philosophy, and I'm coming from it from a student in the college who had, as an economics major and a philosophy minor, and I can sit down and I can think about these things. And Pope Francis has this, really wonderful idea. And I mean, it's true that if you change supply and demand and you change what the culture is, you'll change like these negative impacts on the world. And I'm currently reading Why Information Grows by Cesar Hidalgo. And something he notes is that right now, there was a study where the main exports from underdeveloped countries are in primary resources. And the main exports, and he kind of makes this up on his own, from the developed countries is crystallized imagination. And the idea is that these countries are the ones who are innovating and thinking these things. Now, I guess what the problem is that if we're here in the United States, obviously a more developed country than a lot of, my interest is in Latin America, a lot of Latin American countries, and we decide, okay, let's rethink what being human is, and what being human is does not involve using these primary resources. Sure, there will be great long-term positive effects, but how do we reconcile the fact that people living in poverty who maybe their only income and their only livelihood comes from sort of, I mean, and I guess, yeah, exploiting these natural resources. I mean, how do we justify that? Even if there are going to be great long-term effects, there's obviously going to be, even if this can happen quickly, there's going to be a very negative effect in the short run.
The negative, just so I'm clear on understanding of that last, but the negative effect in the short run, by that you mean?
Well, I mean, I think economic depression in
Okay.
these countries that are, their primary export is these natural
Okay.
resources.
Okay, good. Thank you, yes. Yeah. I'm beat up on economics quite a bit and technology even more. Apologies. In some ways, I see myself as trying to get a seat at the table, not push everybody else, out of their chair. When I think of climate change in particular, the economists get all the fun. Basically, they get everybody listens to what they have to say, and economists are really important. I would hope that the philosophers could just join the conversation, and if they did, what I hope they would try to add was a conversation about the ends of our economic arrangement. So Dale Jameson, a philosopher at NYU, has a nice way of putting it. He says, economics can tell us how to achieve our ends efficiently, but not what our ends should be or whether we should be concerned to achieve them efficiently. So as I take it, and this you can make this similar kind about technology, for example. So ethics is valuable insofar as it says, really, what is it that we're trying to pursue? And get some clarity, like, what is the bright, shiny future that we really are after? What does it look like? And then say, design our economies and design our technologies in order to help us achieve that end. So that would be what I would hope we would do. We don't just stop doing economics, we don't stop doing technology, we don't stop doing these things, right? But that we sort of try to decenter them, put them more to the periphery, and say they should be means to achieving really good ends. Now, more specifically about what that would look like for poverty. The end of the book project, I ended up relying on looking for rich narratives. One of the critiques of environmentalists sometimes is that they are frequently just against things. They're against water pollution, they're against air pollution, they're against carbon pollution. But frequently, environmentalists haven't always done a good job of being explicit about what exactly would be a good alternative. What would be this, right? And so, unlike for example, the civil rights movement, right? So they were against Jim Crow, or against segregation, but they're also, right? We had Martin Luther King saying, he has a dream, right? A little black boy and a little white girl are able to hold hands, and this vision of a beautiful future also drove civil rights movement forward. And what we've lacked so far is sort of a green MLK, like somebody who's not only against, like Bill McKibben's close, right? But he doesn't quite go the distance, in my opinion, because he says, like at the end of his book Earth, he talks about a graceful decline. I think it's just like really, that's the best we could do is a graceful decline. I get why he says it, but what I would prefer, what I was looking for when I was thinking about it for my own work was, no wonder environmentalists are just sort of presented as, well, either you join modern society or you live in a yurt in the woods. Like, pick one. Which one do you want to do? And it's a really clear sort of. But environmentalists sort of put themselves in that position by not providing a robust alternative. That's what I'm suggesting. So one alternative, what would that look like? A sort of a good life. What would that look like? So I like Dwayne Elgin has this nice work for the last few decades on voluntary simplicity as an example. Right? How would you choose to live more simply, not out of austerity, but because simplicity means less debt, less anxiety, right? Focusing on the things that tend to make you happy, friends, meaningful work, time in nature, right? And how do you organize your life to do that? And if we all did that, especially in the rich part of the world, we would need far fewer resources. But it's not a life of going without. It's actually voluntarily choosing to live more simply out of recognition of the fact that it'll be a better life. The example I think of in my own life is I chose to live close enough to Gonzaga so I could walk to work. I'm about 1.5 miles away. And people are like, Dr. Henning, he's a good eco-warrior walking to work because he doesn't want to cause the pollution. In some ways, you could see it that way. That's kind of like the sustainability framework, right? Like my footprint is smaller, and that's true. But actually, I like walking better. It takes me about 20 minutes to walk to work, and it's a great way to start and end the day. It's like I get to slowly come into the day, I get just a little bit of passive exercise because I don't get to the gym enough anyway. And my wife is on her way, and she's like, I can pick you up. I'm like, no, I really want to just walk. It's not about just saving the carbon. It's actually a better way. So I don't have a completely satisfactory answer, but I would suggest that if we had a better aim in mind, and then designed economies and technologies in order to achieve that, then it would lower the burden of needing to use resources from other parts of the world considerably. It may not be totally closing the gap, but it would probably give us a few decades breathing room that we could probably use.
I think that's a good ending. Thank you. So next on our agenda is